Today we will dive into real mystical stories that took place in the Carpathians. These mysterious cases are not just fictions or scary legends. They are real events recorded in local archives, eyewitness accounts, and newspaper articles. We'll tell you about the mysterious disappearances of mushroom pickers, experienced foresters, and tourists who left traces on the trails but seemed to just vanish into thin air. These cases have everything in common: mysterious forest tracks, strange finds that appear years later, and local legends that preserve the memory of those who disappeared in the wilds of the Carpathians. Some of these people reappeared days or even weeks later in the same place, not remembering what happened to them and claiming to have been missing for only a few hours. So, if you like stories about the unknown and mystical, like this video, subscribe to our channel and get ready to dive into the Carpathian mysteries. In early October 1972, when the morning mists were descending over the Carpathians, Ivan Synyuk, a 68-year-old Hutsul, an experienced mushroom picker from the village of Zembronia, went to the forest. It was his usual routine. He knew every corner of the nearby forest and could find mushrooms where others had not seen them. That day, he was going to go a little further than the usual route because he had heard from a neighbor that there were a lot of porcini mushrooms in the area of the Chorny Tract. Ivan planned to return by lunchtime, but he never showed up. His family was not very worried at first. Ivan often went into the woods for the whole day, returning with a basket full of mushrooms and always telling them about his finds and his adventure in the mountains. However, when night fell and he did not return, his wife began to sound the alarm. The locals quickly assembled a search party that set out to find him at dawn. For 3 days in a row, dozens of villagers combed the forest, the surrounding area, and the nearby mountains, but to no avail. They found only a few torn mushroom baskets and fragments of old shoes that might have belonged to Ivan. There were no signs of a struggle or panicked escape. It looked as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. In the dense forest, where Ivan knew every path, this was unthinkable. A week later, the search was officially called off, and talk began in the village. The old-timers sadly talked about the curse of the Black Tract, a place that their grandparents and great-grandparents had avoided. According to legends, forest spirits lived there, sometimes calling people with their voices, leading them into the jungle and not allowing them to return. The disappeared were said to have gone beyond the boundary, and even decades later, when someone dared to enter the tract, they would hear the echoes of the voices of those who would never return. One of the local foresters, Vasyl Levchenko, who also took part in the search, later said that while combing the forest, he saw Ivan among the trees. But when he got closer, the man disappeared, and Vasyl heard only a barely audible whisper calling his name. This whisper came from everywhere, as if the mountains themselves were breathing an ancient history hidden from prying eyes. Several months passed, and one winter evening, Ivan's wife found a strange thing on the doorstep of their home. An old wooden flask that he always carried with him, but left at home the day he disappeared. It was covered with a thin layer of frost, and next to it was a basket of mushrooms. The woman, in disbelief, called her neighbors, but no one could explain where the flask came from or where the fresh mushrooms came from in the middle of winter. Since then, locals began to say that Ivan still wandered the forests of the Chorny Tract, picking mushrooms for those who stayed in the village. People said that if you go to the forest at sunset, you can see his shadow among the trees. And, according to an old Hutsul tradition, every year on the day of his disappearance, villagers leave a candle near the forest and a piece of bread to let the spirits let him go home. Today, the forest near the Black Tract seems just as quiet, but now no one approaches it. Even those who did not believe in legends before began to believe that Ivan Synyuk had entered a world from which there is no return, becoming part of the Carpathians, living their own mysterious life. It was a cold and foggy February morning when Vasyl Levchenko, a 43-year-old forester and experienced employee of the Carpathian National Nature Park, went out on his regular rounds. He had been working for the Forest Service for over 20 years and knew every trail and every peak in the Vyshkivsky Pass area. Vasyl was a reserved man who didn't like to talk much, but he knew his job and did it with zeal. That day, he told his colleagues that he planned to check out a new descent in a remote area near the village of Synyuk, where they had recently seen traces of poachers. He planned to return before lunch. When he did not show up by the end of the day, his colleagues panicked. Calls on the radio went unanswered, and Vasyl's phone was out of range. Rescuers, together with local residents, went in search of him that night. Many of them knew that Vasyl had gone to check on his own in an area known for its rugged terrain. The next day, his backpack was found near a stream on an old hunting trail. It contained his water supply, compass, notebook, and some food. It seemed that he had left the backpack here alone, but there were no signs of a struggle or fall around. Over the next 3 days, search teams combed the area, but Vasyl was never found. Locals began to recall other similar cases. 5 years ago, a hunter also disappeared in these places, having last contacted them when he was near a stream. Then, as now, no one found any trace of him, except for his gun, which was left in the same place as Vasyl's backpack. A few weeks later, the rescuers decided to use a thermal imager to follow the same trail. One cold morning, they saw a strange heat signal on the screen near a large boulder. However, when they got there, they found only an empty, mossy area surrounded by dense forest. There was no sign of human presence. The locals believed that there were old hiding places in the forest used by poachers, but those places had long been abandoned and hidden by dense vegetation. Later, one of the young foresters noticed a strange detail. Vasyl's notebook contained coordinates that were not on the official maps. The entry was short, without explanation. When the locals and rescuers went to the site, they found an old abandoned bunker from World War II, almost completely covered with earth and overgrown bushes. Inside, they found a few old newspapers, a rusty lantern, and nothing else. The case remained unresolved, and locals began to say that Vasyl might have stumbled upon the traces of poachers who wanted to hide their activities. Some believed that the bunker might be part of an old smuggling scheme, and Vasyl might have just been on someone's trail. No one knows what happened to him, but his backpack, the coordinates in his notebook, and the abandoned bunker are the only traces he left behind in the Carpathian forests. In September 2021, a group of 6 friends went hiking in the Carpathian Mountains. Their route ran from the famous village of Yasynia to Mount Petros, and then through the Chornohora Ridge. The group consisted of experienced hikers, each of whom had extensive experience in the mountains. Among them was 27-year-old Alexi Borysenko, an ambitious traveler who had conquered mountain peaks many times. His friends joked that he knew the Carpathians like the back of his hand. The morning of the trip was ordinary: fresh air, clear sky, and a cozy autumn forest hiding in a light fog. Alexi often took pictures of the surrounding nature and left short notes in his notebook, describing interesting places and his feelings during the hikes. On the day they reached Petros, Alexi mentioned a small branch trail that he said led to a slope with a fantastic view. His friends didn't mind and decided to give him the opportunity to show them a secret place that was unknown to other tourists. The road was difficult, overgrown, and almost without any landmarks, but Alexi was confident in his abilities. As they climbed the ledge and set up their tents, a thick fog began to descend, covering the mountains in an impenetrable wall. Alexi suddenly said he heard the sound of a river nearby and wanted to check where it was. He left his backpack near the tent and disappeared into the fog, promising to return in 10 minutes. But those 10 minutes turned into half an hour, then an hour, and then the whole night. The next morning, his friends, alarmed, began to look for him. They called out for Alexi, looking for traces, but all their attempts were in vain. Only a few hours later did they manage to find his notebook. The entries in it were strange and disorderly, chaotic phrases and drawings that depicted the outlines of human faces as if they appeared from the fog. Later, friends told him that the last pages of the notebook contained the words, "They are near, between worlds and don't follow them. The search operation began immediately. Local rescuers scoured the mountains, combing the area with drones and dogs. On the second day of the search, the dogs led the group to an old, long-abandoned loggers' hideout. At the entrance, they found Alexi's jacket, which at first glance looked brand new and clean, as if it had just been brought in. However, the traces broke off right next to the hideout, and despite numerous examinations, not a single clue was found. The search continued for several days, but there were no results. Finally, a week later, the operation was called off, leaving Alexi's disappearance unresolved. The story of Alexi's disappearance quickly spread across the Carpathians. Local legends say that the mountains are a place where sometimes the line between worlds becomes thinner, and that at such moments the fog can pull people into a kind of second world. Some believe that Alexi did not disappear without a trace, but simply found himself on the border between two dimensions, where he remained forever. After his return, his friends also talked about disturbing feelings and dreams in which they saw Alexi standing in the fog and gesturing for them to follow him. Now, every time the Carpathians are covered in thick fog, locals whisper quietly, "Do not go into the fog because it can take you to those who are already lost." But these are just rumors without any facts. Alexi's body was never found, and he remains missing to this day. In August 2023, a group of 5 tourists went hiking in the Carpathians, planning to conquer the top of Mount Ivan. Among them was 32-year-old Andrii Kovalenko, an experienced traveler from Kyiv. The group carefully prepared for the trip, checked their equipment and weather conditions. The first days of the hike went smoothly. The tourists enjoyed the scenery and clean mountain air. On the third day, while crossing through a dense forest, Andrii suggested shortening the path by turning to a lesser-known trail he had marked on the map. The group agreed, trusting his experience. The trail turned out to be more difficult than expected. It was narrow, overgrown, and almost impassable in places. After a few hours of hard walking, the tourists decided to take a break. Andrii, wanting to explore the area, went ahead, promising to return in 15 minutes. However, half an hour passed and he did not return. His worried friends started calling for Andrii, but there was no answer. They decided to split into 2 groups to search for him, agreeing to meet in an hour at the campsite. The search was fruitless. Andrii was nowhere to be found, and no trace of his presence was found. The next morning, after a sleepless night, the tourists decided to return to the main route and report Andrii's disappearance to the rescuers. They reached the nearest village and contacted the local authorities. The rescue operation began immediately. Over the next few days, dozens of rescuers, volunteers, and local residents searched the forest using dogs and drones. The search was complicated by dense vegetation and difficult terrain. On the 5th day, rescuers found Andrii's backpack near a small stream. It contained all his belongings, including his phone with a dead battery. This discovery gave hope, but further searches yielded no results. 2 weeks later, active search operations were suspended, although local residents continued to periodically inspect the area. The disappearance of Andrii Kovalenko left many questions unanswered. Friends and family could not understand how an experienced tourist could disappear without a trace in a familiar area. Some assumed that he could have been injured and unable to return, while others talked about the possibility of an encounter with wild animals. However, none of the versions has been confirmed. In the summer of 1990, Mykhailo Hnatyuk, a well-known local mushroom picker and expert on the Carpathian forests, went mushroom picking in the direction of the Lysike tract. Despite the fact that the tract had a mysterious reputation, Mykhailo had gone there many times on his own, and this time he promised his wife to return before lunch. He took with him the usual mushroom picker's kit, a basket, a knife, and a map of local trails that had almost fallen apart. When the sun set behind the mountains and Mykhailo did not return, his wife raised the alarm. By noon the next day, the residents of Zembronia set out to find him. They knew that he, an experienced mushroom picker, could hardly have gotten lost. They combed the usual places, climbed the slopes, but there was no sign of Mykhailo. On the third day of the search, one of the foresters who joined the operation came across a strange place, an old meadow with twisted trees, as if they were sick, standing in the shape of a large circle. In the center of the circle was an old, cracked stone with carved symbols that no one could recognize. The locals called such places zones of power, where they preferred not to go unnecessarily. The next night, the two rescuers stayed overnight at the entrance to the Lysaki tract, where they often saw Mykhailo during his hikes. In the middle of the night, when the fog began to descend on the forest, they noticed a faint blue light in the distance, between the trees. It did not move, but it seemed as if the light was pulsating, sensing their presence. They moved toward the light, but as they approached, it moved further into the forest. It seemed to them that someone was playing with them, luring them deeper into the forest. After a few minutes, they realized that they had lost their way and were in a completely unfamiliar part of the forest. On the sixth day of the search, when the rescuers were running out of energy and starting to lose hope, something inexplicable happened. A group of locals combing the slopes near the Lysaki tract suddenly came across Mykhailo. He was calmly picking mushrooms, bending down by the roots of an old oak tree, and did not even realize that the search was going on around him, and that it had already covered all the nearby villages. "Mykhailo, my God, where have you been? We've been looking for you for 5 days," one of the rescuers shouted, not believing his eyes. Mykhailo stood up, looking at them in surprise, as if they had just appeared from another world. He had a look of confusion on his face. "The 5th day? What are you talking about? I just came here in the morning, as usual. I was picking mushrooms, and here you all are," he replied, as if nothing unusual had happened. The rescuers were dumbfounded. Mykhailo looked completely calm, and had no idea that dozens of people had been looking for him for days. He assured them that he hadn't been picking mushrooms for long, even claiming that he had left home only a few hours ago. Meanwhile, the rescuers noticed that Mykhailo's clothes were in the same condition as the day he disappeared, with no traces of dirt or wear and tear, as one would expect from a man who had spent 5 days in the woods. The basket contained fresh mushrooms, just picked, damp with morning dew, as if he had really just started picking. Talking to him further, the rescuers noticed a strange calmness in his behavior, as if it was just another day for him. Mykhailo couldn't understand why they were asking him about the tract, where he had been, and why, as the rescuers said, they had seen a strange light in the forest that night. He was sure that he had left the village only a few hours ago. The rescuers were puzzled. Mykhailo seemed to have emerged from the heart of the forest, appeared like a ghost, and looked as if time had simply stopped for him at the moment he went into the forest. After Mykhailo Hnatyuk's unexpected return, local newspapers were filled with headlines like, "Has the mushroom picker returned from the other world?" and "Carpathian Forest, Myth or Reality?" Journalists were actively discussing the mysterious disappearance of the mushroom picker, who, according to rescuers, acted as if he had not been searched for 5 days. The stories about his meeting with the search team on the outskirts of the Lysaki tract sounded so strange that it seemed like a work of fantasy or an urban legend. The local newspaper Hutsulski Visti published the testimony of the rescuers, who claimed to have found Mykhailo in perfect condition, without signs of fatigue or even minor scratches, typical of a long stay in the forest. With fresh mushrooms in his basket and no idea why they were looking for him, Mykhailo remained a mystery that fascinated not only his fellow villagers but also residents of neighboring villages. However, most people did not believe the story. Newspaper readers and listeners of the local radio looked at it as a sensationalized story that was made up to attract attention. Many assumed that Mykhailo had simply gotten lost and eventually found his way back, but denied being scared so as not to embarrass himself in front of the community. Others believed that the story was made up by journalists to stir up mystical mood around the Lysaki tract. That's all for now. Thank you for staying with us to the end. Don't forget to like us, leave your comments, and share your own stories and opinions. Take care of yourself, and remember, nature can sometimes hide secrets that we don't even know about.